Hey everyone. So what I want to talk about today or at this in this video is how we got into the trouble that we're in. And the thing is there are conspiracy theories, and I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I tend to believe that people generally, not everybody, but generally people do what they think is best at the moment that they do them. Some of them have nefarious intent, but the truth is that sometimes when you believe something to be true and you believe something else to not be true, that hmm, somehow lying is okay. All right, so go back. Gosh, it's more than 50 years, I think. And there was this guy named Ancel Keys who had a hypothesis that the rise in cardiac disease was due to the amount of saturated fat in our diet. It was a hypothesis. Now, honestly, at the same time as he was thinking about saturated fat, he also believed, as did the medical community, believed that tobacco smoking was healthy and everybody did it. And it got increasing over time. Now we laugh about, well, it's not a laughable matter, but we can laugh at the silliness of that thought today because of science. And I believe the day will come when we laugh at the silliness of this epidemic of metabolic disease that has come, I believe, directly from the work of Ancel Keys. So what he did was he went to a whole bunch of countries and did epidemiological studies. Epidemiological studies are basically like, let's look at the incidence of cardiovascular disease in this area. If we are hypothesizing that it's saturated fat, we're going to um, look for how much saturated fat, not considering other variables. We're going to look for the amount of saturated fat. Now, Ancel Keys went to a bunch of countries and asked these questions. He asked people what they ate over the last year. I'm going to challenge you right now to sit down and figure out what you ate over the last year. All right, so you know where I'm coming from, right? So out of all of these places, out of all of these places that he went, I believe it was 21 countries. I'm not sure. But he chose 7 that seemed to agree with his hypothesis. That basically means 14 did not agree with his hypothesis. Now, he believed it to be true. Either that or he was a principled, let's not use the word. But so he published this study, and he had a dynamic personality. And he went to conferences. And all of a sudden, people started buying in because it made sense. Eat fat, right? If you eat fat, then it's going to clog your arteries because you're eating too much fat and you're going to get cholesterol. Oh, that word, cholesterol, the fear of it all. Your body needs cholesterol. It makes cholesterol, and your brain can't live without it. Enough. Enough. In fact, there are studies that demonstrate that people with higher cholesterol levels actually live longer. But I'm not going to go into all of that. You can find all of that online. There are studies. It's well worth looking at. But we'll talk about cholesterol in another place anyway. But so that was his hypothesis. And then he was very persuasive. And there were lots of scientists at the time that disagreed with him, that actually pointed at things like sugar and pointed at things like tobacco, or basically just pointed out that he cherry picked his data. Now, what happened to those scientists, because they were not part of the meme, they would lose their funding. They would be blackballed. So the entire scientific medical community, either the entire thing was involved in this huge conspiracy, or they honestly believed it to be true. Take your pick. All right. But it wasn't true. And so what happened was we adopted this fad diet. It actually started probably in the 80s, if I recall, this low fat movement or fat free movement. All of the seed oils that we now know as healthy, and note the air quotes around healthy, because they're not. They're chemically extracted. They're actually quite detrimental to they should be labeled unhealthy when they're chemically extracted. We'll talk about oils in another video too, I promise. But this is just about how we got here, right? So we moved from saturated animal fat, saving bacon grease in a can on the stove for cooking, to using these seed oils and eating margarine instead of butter, and all sorts of things that happened as a result of Ancel Keys' dynamic personality, his persuasiveness, and his cherry-picked research, which has been proven wrong. It was proven wrong back then, but because they believed it, they followed it. And so we have watched the incidence of cardiovascular disease rise over this period of time, even despite the fact that smoking has decreased over the last 15, 20 years. So what we know is that a fair portion of the cardiovascular disease, or we can hypothesize, I don't have any evidence. I'm not a scientist. The evidence, though, is that cardiovascular disease can be attributed to tobacco smoking, certainly, and cancer, certainly. However, it is a dietary issue. And what has changed in the diet? We have gone from meat and vegetables as a standard healthy meal to vegetables and grains as a healthy meal. Again, air quotes around the words healthy meal. And which meant if we're doing vegetables and grains, vegetables and sugar, highly processed food, manufactured food, then all of a sudden our carbohydrate intake has increased over all of this time, going up to the point where carbohydrates form the bulk of our diet. Now, it was either 79 or 80, but I think it was 1980, that the USDA created this thing called the food pyramid, which said basically the bulk of our diet should come from grains. And you know what, grains themselves aren't evil, but the quantities in which we consume them are amazing. And of course, we've developed, farm policy and industrial farming and villainized. Do you remember when eggs were bad news? You might not. I do. And then eggs were good for you, and then they were bad news, and then they're good for you again. During the low fat, fat-free phase, People were eating egg whites left, right, and center and forget the yolks because that's where the cholesterol is. And so all of that culminates in this epidemic level of, excuse me, I've got to close the door. My cat is crying. All of that dominated in this epidemic level of obesity and diabetes and metabolic disease. Oh, well, metabolic disease is the overall umbrella. So that's where it comes from. And we knew way back when, scientifically, if we just looked with unbiased eyes at the science and let the scientists actually battle it out fairly, maybe we would have avoided this level of obesity and diabetes. We didn't do that. Now the medical profession, this long-standing tradition of fat. Now, I want to talk to you just a little bit about that fat thing, and we'll talk about it again later. But understand that the argument, the biggest argument against fat, doesn't rely on whether or not we can digest it. It relies on calories in, calories out, eat less, exercise more. Again, a false narrative. So in 1990, I went to a nutritionist and she showed me a diet. She told me we were going to go on a low fat diet. She showed me a picture of 4 ounces of meat and told me how much protein there was, and then said, look, you can eat this mountain of beans and get the same amount of protein. We'll talk about animal versus vegetable protein later. But she showed that to me. I preferred the beans anyway at the time. And so it was easy. What she didn't say, didn't understand, or didn't acknowledge was that those beans came with a bunch of carbohydrates. The protein in beans is mostly the beans are mostly carbohydrate, not mostly protein. So, but carbohydrates weren't bad back then, they thought. And so it was okay. Why was it okay? Because 1 gram of carbohydrates equals, I think it's 9 calories. And then, no, I got that wrong. 1 gram of carbohydrates, 1 gram of fat. Edit. 1 gram of fat has twice as many calories as carbohydrates or protein. So it is, and don't forget, protein has some fat. So we're talking about lean, dry pieces of meat. So this whole movement toward vegetarianism, veganism, don't get mad at me, this whole movement toward away from meat. Okay, granted, we can talk about the meat industry and what's wrong with it. But the point is that it was all based on calories, and calories only count. I'm going to tell you right now, calories don't count. But calories only count if the person is a compulsive eater and eating so many calories in a day. In fact, I taught at a university where they had a dance program, and I knew a dance major who literally consumed 5,000 calories a day and was as thin as a rail. All right. And he said he ate those calories because he used them. He believed that he burned them. I think his body was probably exceptionally efficient. But the point is that it's not about calories. And that's where the argument, the fat-free, everything was fat-free. What did they do with those highly processed foods that were fat-free? Fat adds flavor, right? Or enhances flavor. They took out the fat and added sugar instead, and sugar under all these chemical names. Listen to me now. It's wrong. Unlearn this. Calories don't matter. When we talk about overeaters later, you'll learn something. But at this point, calories don't count. If you restrict your calories, you will lose weight. Absolutely. It gets harder and harder the more often you try that. But the point is that calorie restriction doesn't solve the problem. All right. Joseph Onesta, this is where we've come from. The Onesta process. This is the thing that we need to understand so that when we're working with our clients and we see this thought process coming up, coming out of what they're saying in their mouth, they'll use calories, they'll talk about calories. We have to know that part of our job is to educate them away from that old mode, fear of calories, fear of fat. We're moving away from that toward a healthy human diet. Ciao.